the scene was just such a cool, tight-knit thing where it felt like a family.
You could feel it literally getting bigger every week. I'm honored to have been a part of that, and the creativity was just everywhere. It was incredible, it was infectious.
At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul, when that dropped, it was just just the sheer energy of the whole record was the thing I noticed at first. It was like everything's just
Yeah, that.
Jesus.
Yeah, and his voice, because it was like Carcass and him were the only bands really that kind of had that high, sort of like crunchy sounding vocal, where death metal in general was very low and growly, which I liked, but when that record came out, it blew me away.
I remember Slaughter of the Soul very well.
But it was, I mean, when At the Gates started, they were not anywhere near that sound. It sounded completely different. It was more atheist, like jazzy, stranger structures, not as direct. And on Terminal Spirit Disease, which is the EP right before Slaughter of the Soul, you can see like what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And when they released, it was like, whoa.
And then like the lyrics, dude, 22 Years of Pain, I could feel it closing in. What is that, Dead But Dreaming? Like the lyrics were so heavy and so good, and man, and then like the acoustic interlude stuff and the melody. To this day, you put that record on, I will destroy things.
What are you gonna break?
Whatever, put it in front of me, I'll break it.
My heart?
Yes. No, I think it changed music. I mean, and still, you can't hold a candle to that record. Bands have tried. No, you can't.
You can hold it to it.
It's a dumbass.
Don't light it on fire though.
It's a 5-star record, untouchable. It's still, I'm not cool enough. That's what it made me feel like. I gotta like rethink everything. I'm still can't measure up to At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul.
But at that point, not that many people reacted. It was way later. I mean, when At the Gates were over here and touring and everything, and they quit, I think just that have made them grow even bigger, and because they were not around. So that album just took its own life, and it's an amazing album. But at that point, it was more like, cool guys, fucking awesome, great. But you couldn't see what that would do to the world and to the music in general.
First time I ever heard Dillinger Escape Plan, I was like listening to the CD in my car, and I was like, damn, it's skipping, it's a brand new CD, and it's like, no, that's what it is. It's on first listen, it sounds so chaotic. It sounds like an engine just tearing itself apart. But like, the more you get into it, the more you realize it's really complex. It's a lot like jazz. So as a musician, it's really, really deep if you allow yourself to kind of dive into it. But on first listen, it's just so gnarly.
The first song I heard was Panasonic Youth. And I remember as soon as that finished, I put it back on again, listened to it about 10 times in a row. And I tried to learn it on drums, failed. And just, it blew my mind how good it was. But then I was a fan of them, but then I was a fan of Architects as well, because I wasn't in Architects at the start. So I was going to like local shows, and Architects sounded a lot like Dillinger Escape Plan in the early days.
Yeah, absolutely. Dillinger Escape Plan is like, when I heard Calculating Infinity and 43% Burn, like that was the most extreme metal I think I had heard at the time, and I couldn't believe that it was like humans creating it, you know, and it was just kind of beyond my comprehension at the time, and it hugely, like, you know, cemented the chaos. And not to mention, when I finally got to see them live, I don't think I've ever, it's the most intense.
One of the gnarliest shows.
Yeah, it was incredible to see, you know, such talent and musicianship, but also like the entertainment aspect and just the kind of just raw violence, you know, that you just are watching, and it's just violent, like lighting, and just everything is like very abrasive. So yeah, they're sick.
Yeah, I just remember being stood there with like a lot of my friends. We were all in like hardcore bands, and you know, we could barely count to 4. But yeah, what a great band, and so influential. And Greg actually sang on our record, and yeah, just a great dude, great people. Ben Wyman's awesome as well, and yeah, great dudes.
The metal scene, you know, Orange County, California, was breeding bands like As I Lay Dying and Atreyu. And at the same time, in my neck of the woods, bands like Killswitch Engage and All That Remains and Shadows Fall were breaking out of the scene. and constantly playing at places like the Worcester Palladium and the Webster in Hartford, Connecticut. And from there, our sound sort of just developed into a combination of those early melodic punk rock influences with the heavier edge of the metalcore scene.
Massachusetts felt like a serious hotbed for metal and hardcore back in the 90s for myself.
Yeah.
It's just like, now that we're been in the band and toured the US and stuff, it's just, what a cool way to just, have your band come up and, all the camaraderie between all the other bands that were happening at the time. It was just, the scene was just such a cool, tight-knit thing where it felt like a family.
Yeah, and
almost,
another thing too, I mean, even just New England in general, not just Massachusetts. I mean, where I was in Providence, Rhode Island, you had hardcore bands and you had metal bands, and they were still separate in the early days. And then you started to see people wearing Maiden shirts and Slayer shirts at hardcore shows. You started to see kids with long hair showing up to hardcore shows and vice versa.
And all the hardcore kids are like, dude, why are you wearing a metal shirt?
Exactly.
Ugh.
And then it was like, before you knew it, that same guy that was making fun of it is playing Slayer riffs in their hardcore band. And it started to really it was a great time because it felt like there were no rules, It felt like when the hardcore and the metal scene started to come together, it was such a creative time. You had bands like Candiria adding jazz and like hip hop to it. And then you had Shadows Fall just doing full-on thrash and death metal.
When we first started, we were literally just getting in our beat-up van and going to play VFW halls and people's basements, people's living rooms, and crash on their couch or maybe sleep in the van at a rest stop, that kind of thing. And we were just really doing it for the joy of the music, joy of the being on the interstate and going to play for people we'd never met before. And that kind of evolved with us doing that into getting into bars, playing bars, and then playing bigger shows and people starting to notice. And fast forward a little bit to the early 2000s, and we had changed our name to Lamb of God, and this whole metal and hardcore scene was just really blowing up everywhere. And especially for us, the first signs of it were up in the Northeast. And we always, at first, we would go up there and see how big the shows are and how many bands there were. And we kind of felt like the weird Southern cousins, like showing up, and people knew who we were and we were part of these shows, and then we'd go back home and be like, that was awesome.
The metalcore movement is something that we discovered or encountered really early with bands like Killswitch and Shadows Fall. I think we took Killswitch on some of their first shows, right?
Yeah, we even had, I think, both Killswitch and Shadows Fall playing a show in Worcester, like early on one of our early tours.
Yeah, I think that during that time period, like I want to say maybe 2002 through like 2006, there was that combination of the energy of hardcore, but with some of the technicality of metal, and that combination was something really special. And it was cool to be watching, programs on networks like Fuse TV that sadly I don't think exists anymore, but I really like that station. And they were covering bands like Killswitch and All That Remains, and I started to realize, wow, a lot of these bands that are breaking out in the national scene are from New England, from where I'm from. And for a second I thought, what, am I getting just the station that like is the Fuse broadcast just from New England, because they're covering a lot of Massachusetts bands? But I started to realize that those bands from my neck of the woods were really sort of becoming tastemakers in the scene and influencing the younger bands to come.
It was a great time, and it felt very vibrant, but it all really stemmed from, I think, bands like Agnostic Front, that were strictly hardcore and started in the late 80s to really add, that metal element, that crossover thrash thing that was happening. And that kind of just spiraled into the hardcore scene. I look back on it, I'm honored to have been a part of that, and the creativity was just everywhere. It was incredible, it was infectious. And you go to a show and you never knew what you were going to get. Bands didn't sound the same. There wasn't that set tone, that metalcore wasn't even a fucking term, it was just hardcore bands, metal bands. It was great, man.
As things evolved just in the early 2000s and into mid 2000s, the whole scene just exploded, and bands were getting signed to major labels, and we were one of those bands, and it just started happening for us. And it's funny, like, to reminisce about that. I've talked to a couple people about that today, where just how exciting that time was and how you could feel it literally getting bigger every week, and just felt like you were a part of a movement that was much bigger than just your band.
for me, the mix of singing and screaming came from gothic death metal. Bands like Paradise Lost, Edge of Sanity, My Dying Bride. I was really into that gothic death metal thing as well as being a hardcore and punk kid. And Faith No More is another, like Angel Dust, that was a huge game changer for me. I mean, hearing what he was doing with his voice over heavy music and adding this bellowing vocals.
He's just in a whole new other category.
Yeah,
though.
he's an alien.
Mike Patton just does insane things with his voice that no one else can touch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, it was gothic death metal. Did it way before metalcore did, you know?
I just remember it being very taboo to have singing if you're in a heavy band. You know, it's just like, dude, that's not brutal. What are you trying to do?
Yeah.
What? And we've just always been the kind of people that don't really give a shit what other people think. We do what we like. You know, we like melody. You know, like we like music, and we like having all different elements of all, you know, other things. Not just, it doesn't have to sound like metal all the time. You know, I think it's cool when you do something different and unique, and just make it yours and make it sound cool.
Yeah, different textures too.
Yeah.
You can really draw out a different emotion when you're singing versus screaming, and vice versa. And to be able to like play with that stylistically, as well as the yelling that we did in the early, well, we still kind of do some yelling too. Just adding texture, adding something that's interesting to listen to, and stirs you in certain ways. That straight screaming through the whole thing is just like it's like a straight line. It's nice to have the peaks and valleys of music.
Yeah. And now we've made the same song for 20 years.
Yeah. And you're still buying it.
Because it's kind of like if you're doing like the singing and screaming and stuff, it's like one part's like kind of heavy, and then you're going to be screaming over it, and then like another part like leads itself more to melody. And I mean, I guess in listening to bands that have that balance, it can kind of like push boundaries for a listener.
We even have bands like It Dies Today where it's like a mostly clean vocal.
Right.
But
really
really heavy.
Yeah, I think that the reason sort of screamed verses and melodic choruses started to be like, you know, the quintessential way of writing a metalcore song is because it opened, you know, the audience up to not being just people who liked heavy music with screamed harsh vocals. You know, you would you know, a listener might turn it on who only likes rock music and hear this really huge chorus that was as big as any sort of pop rock or rock band out, but then it would go into this, you know, really dark screamed verse or breakdown. And I think, you know, I think anytime you hear screaming for the first time, I remember when I heard it in a song, it was like, it took me back a little bit, but I think the more that it was, you know, gaining popularity, people gave it a bit more of a chance, and I think that it was sort of, it made you appreciate the melodic moments more, having come from some sort of heaviness, you know, just the contrast between the lightness and the dark, I think really spoke to people.
With the early beginnings of the internet, people were really able, like myself included, were really able to start to find other bands via websites like mp3.com or like
HXCMP3.com.
Yeah, HXCMP3.com, and there was like probably like live journal communities and just random like beginnings of internet stuff that was like people were finding music in a new way, and I think that allowed that music to go further and to kind of be transported to a place that the predecessors didn't necessarily have, that because they were so heavy and they were in, you know, record stores, but at the same time, like it was like an underground hardcore community. And I think with the internet and websites and file sharing and stuff like that, it allowed it to become much more accessible.
It kind of like made the scene more sustainable. The scene went just from being the local scene, your local scene, to now something that existed on social media platforms, which allowed bands like Devil Wears Prada, bands like August Burns Red, bands like, I mean, you can name any of the countless bands that even we came up with that allowed everyone kind of a new platform.
I think that for the most part, it was inspiring to see bands that had come up through your scene and that you had seen at small local shows, you know, Elks Clubs and VFWs, and seeing them sort of get the national spotlight as far as this scene of music was just really inspiring to the bands that were trying to do the same thing, because you're saying to yourself, oh, if they can do it, you know, maybe we can too. It's not so out of reach if you're seeing people who came through the same sort of channels as your band is going through now, playing the same kind of venues and using the same promoters and having them be on, you know, big national tours like Ozfest. And I remember actually seeing, after I think it was Ozfest 2004, that MTV had this show called Battle for Ozfest, and it was, you know, a ton of great bands at that time coming up and playing on like the smaller stages like Unearth, Bleeding Through, As I Lay Dying, Killswitch, and to see, you know, MTV, which at that time, you know, I associated MTV with only sort of, you know, more mainstream music. You know, the heaviest kind of stuff they would cover is like maybe Korn or Limp Bizkit on TRL, which, you know, I like those bands, but they weren't, you know, as heavy or as sort of underground and edgy as this other scene. And to see like a channel like MTV starting to cover those bands was really cool and made me think, wow, this kind of music can really become big and stand the test of time potentially.
Influential metalcore albums in Australia in the 2000s. Top of the list would have to be like Killswitch Engage, because I think they, like End of Heartache was probably the most influential metalcore album going. The amount of Killswitch imitation bands that came out after that record was ridiculous. I'm going to throw props out to Unearth as well, The Oncoming Storm. In terms of like the guitaring married with like the breakdowns was, again, you can tell imitation is like the ultimate form of flattery, and the amount of like Unearth clone bands that came out, man, including Parkway at that point in time, were influenced so hard by Unearth. The Oncoming Storm was like a bomb going off in Australia when it happened.
There was like Ferret and Metal Blade, and there was a bunch of like Century Media, a bunch of like labels putting out like really good metalcore and classic like metal records like Killswitch. I think everyone loved Killswitch. I know for a fact Tom and Dan from Architects, that was like their gateway band into heavy music, and I seem to like remember it for like bands like It Dies Today and like All Shall Perish and like all those other bands as well, and like Norma Jean, and yeah, good stuff.
I think that metalcore got a bit formulaic for a while. You know, there were a few labels that, and of course you can't blame these labels, they had a lot of success, but they sort of, they put out bands almost every week that sounded the same. And I think that people got tired of it, and I think that's why metalcore died off for a bit. And I think it's coming back now in a way that is a little bit more melodic. I think that more bands are sort of embracing that radio sort of, you know, octane kind of sound. And to me, I think that, you know, I don't have a problem with any of that stuff because I like pop music and I like melody, not just harsh vocals. But I think that a lot of mistakes that bands make is that they're only looking in their scene for their influences. You know, they're saying, you know, if we're going to write a song that has a shot at radio, whether it's, you know, terrestrial or Sirius, that they have to figure out how did the band that's at #1 right now get there. And I think that's why you see a lot of bands like, you know, copying bands like Bring Me the Horizon and stuff. And I think that the bands that stand the test of time are the ones that are a bit different. And yes, you know, you can put out something that's very derivative and maybe have a hit or two, but I think at the end of the day, if you look at historically what bands succeed in the long run and have longevity, they're the ones that brought something a little bit different to the table and sort of played by their own rules. So I'm hoping that's the direction that the scene goes in, that bands aren't only looking within this world for influences.